Welcome to this Whatcom Watersheds Information Network Speaker Series event. And before we get started, I wanted to briefly introduce the Whatcom Watersheds Information Network, which is otherwise known as WIN. WIN is an organization made up of a diverse group of citizens, agencies, nonprofits, and businesses, all involved in water resource and natural resources education. We are an apolitical, non-advocacy organization. Our mission is to help protect and restore our local waters and other natural resources by enhancing education, public involvement, and collaboration. And we host events such as this one. And in addition to speaker series events, we also coordinate the annual Water Week Festival, which is a week-long series of events that takes place in September. And organizations around the county host events that celebrate water, foster greater appreciation for the importance of water resources in our lives, and promote better stewardship. Anyone is welcome to join WIN, which basically means signing up for our e-newsletter, which we provide to help keep members informed about water-related local and regional events, new resources, and funding opportunities. We try to facilitate more collaboration between local organizations, and we also offer periodic trainings. And to learn more about WIN, you can visit whatcomwin.org, where you'll find a link to subscribe to the email newsletter on the homepage. And I also want to let you know that I'll be following up via email with a survey link so that you can give us your feedback about this event. And we're going to get rolling in just a moment. I'll introduce Jenny Coe. Is that how you pronounce your last name, Jenny?
Yes.
Thank you. And since it is such a small group, I would normally say we'll hold questions until the end, but since it's just this very small group today, I think it's probably okay to go ahead and just speak up if you have a question as we're going along. Does that work all right?
Works for me.
Okay. And just wanted to let you know also that this event is being recorded. So I will stop sharing, and now I'm delighted to introduce Jenny. Jenny Coe is the Whatcom and Skagit Conservation Districts Community Wildfire Resilience Coordinator. She's been serving conservation districts in Washington State since 2001 and working with communities and partners on wildfire preparedness in the Pacific Northwest region for 20 years. She currently coordinates the Community Wildfire Resilience Program for both Whatcom and Skagit Conservation Districts. Jenny splits her time between working one-on-one with landowners and neighborhood groups on wildfire preparedness and working at the planning scale with local, state, and federal partners to assess risk and create collaboration opportunities in her region. Jenny has a degree from Huxley College of the Environment at Western Washington University.
Okay. Thanks, Cheryl. Appreciate it. Hello, everyone. It's a small group tonight. So as Cheryl said, feel free to raise your hand or interrupt and ask me whatever questions come up as I'm going along. This can be a nice casual presentation / conversation. So, I guess I should share my screen. That would be the first thing to do. Give me a second here. Here. Okay. Can you guys see my screen?
Not yet, but I see. Oh, there we go.
Okay. So let's see. Let's go up here. Okay. So the topic that I'm presenting on this evening is on how to improve the wildfire safety of your property. And so I'm going to, everything good over here? I heard something, so we're all good. Okay.
Yep.
I'm trying to advance my slide. Give me a second here. Okay. So when I give this presentation, I like to start out with sort of setting the stage on how we are viewing wildfire risk in Western Washington, because we're used to seeing, regular large destructive wildfires in the other part of our state, on the other side of the mountains. Yet we have seen some destructive wildfires on the west side as well. And so it's always a curiosity to people whether there is wildfire risk in Western Washington and if it's increasing. And we do know through a lot of research that I follow through the UW Climate Impacts Group, who have done a lot of studies on this, that wildfire risk is increasing in Western Washington. And they know that because there's a number of factors that are feeding into our changing climate. And one of those is increasing air temperatures, less rain in the summer, and our snow is melting earlier in the season. And all of those factors basically lead to drier fuels. What we're calling fuels is basically vegetation, and our forests are drying out. We have seen some evidence of this over the last few years with our Western red cedars and our Western hemlocks and our big leaf maples that are struggling to thrive in a drought, years of drought in this changing climate. So we're seeing these changes on the ground. People are seeing these things happen on their properties. So there's a lot of interesting questions as to, what this means for wildfire. Okay. So we know that risk is increasing in Western Washington, and so it's important to be thinking about how we can reduce risk on our properties. And one of the best places to start is by kind of understanding what we're looking at as far as fire behavior. So there's basically three types of ignition sources. There's what we call a surface fire, which is essentially basically what it sounds like is fire moving across the surface of the ground and burning whatever in its path that is flammable until it hits a spot where there's nothing to burn, or it hits a non-flammable area. So fire moving across the surface of the ground. It can spread to houses. It moves quickly through tall, dry grass, as you probably know. And then there's the crown fires, which are something that we don't really see in our area. I mean, these are pictures of crown fires we're usually seeing from northern Canada or California or Montana sometimes. And that's when basically the fire is moving across the top of the canopy of the forest. And it moves very rapidly, and it's extremely, extremely hot, and it creates some crazy fire behavior. But that's not something we really see around here. Blowing embers are the third potential ignition source, and those are, as you probably know, basically pieces of burning material that get picked up by the wind and can be carried over a mile ahead of a fire, sometimes more, and start spot fires in other places. But they tend to get trapped in places that go unnoticed. They get lodged in cracks and crevices around homes and blown in through vents. And so blowing embers are really the number one reason that homes ignite in wildfires. And so when we're looking at how to protect properties, we're really focused, we're focused both on surface, we're really focused on those blowing embers because they cause so much damage. So in the science that's been done and the research that's been done on how homes burn down in wildfires, and where you can have the most impact to protecting your structures and your property, the discovery was essentially that homes are igniting due to the condition of the structures themselves and everything around them out to 100 feet from the foundation of that structure. And they've termed this zone the home ignition zone. So again, when we're looking at protecting our properties, we're really actually narrowing in on that home ignition zone, because that's where you're going to have the most effect in protecting your structures and protecting your property. So I should point out that this is assuming that the topography is flat. If you are on a slope, your home ignition zone might need to be extended out further, out to like 200 feet, just kind of depends on the slope that you're on and the conditions. But in general, we say the home ignition zone is the structure and out 100 feet. So that's where we're going to focus. So I'm going to talk about some of the specifics of how to protect your home, and then we'll kind of work out from there to talk about landscaping and the plants and more the forested area and the different types of activities or actions you can take within those areas. So probably one of the most important things to realize when we're talking about this stuff is that it really is the little things that can make a huge difference in protecting your home. And when I'm doing wildfire risk assessments on people's properties, sometimes the things I say seem like the tiniest little thing or something really nitpicky, but it's really those things that make a difference because of the behavior of burning embers. So we're going to get into that a little bit. But basically, small modifications that you can make to the construction of your home and the vegetation around your home can really make a big difference on the survivability of your home. And so one of the things to keep in mind is that when I'm talking about these actions, we're kind of considering the worst case scenario where if there is a fire and you have to be evacuated and there aren't enough resources to be there to protect your home, then will your home survive on its own? And so these actions will help your home survive on its own if nobody is there to protect it. And of course, it also helps create a safer space for firefighters if they are able to be there to help protect your home. So we start at the roof because, the roof is really the biggest, most exposed surface area of your home. So the roof material and the maintenance of the roof is a huge part of whether your home is protected or not from a wildfire. And so the recommended roofing is called Class A fire rated roofing, and a composition shingle roof and a metal roof and other types of roofs like clay tile and there's other types of materials that you can have your roof be made out of that we don't see as much in the Pacific Northwest. But these are all very fire resistant roofing materials. Obviously, untreated shake roofs are extremely flammable. So those are not a good option. And I think a lot of communities are, stray away from allowing those to be put on for new construction. But the maintenance of that roof is really important. So roofs tend to collect a lot of dry debris like dead leaves and pine needles and things like that are shown in this picture in the gutter. So those accumulate in roof valleys. They accumulate in gutters, and they're fine fuels, which means they ignite really easily. When you have a lot of those accumulated and you have embers landing in there, then you end up with a very flammable situation where the edge of your roof or the trim of your roof can catch on fire, or if your roof isn't in good shape, that fire can get under the shingles or various other places that are exposed. So it's really important to keep your roof clean and your gutters free of debris. So as far as the siding material, the way to look at siding is that if you have a flammable type siding, which would be wood or vinyl, because vinyl can melt, it's really what you have up against your siding that can make a big difference as to whether that siding ignites, because by itself, embers just blowing at your siding are probably most likely going to bounce off, but then they're going to land in whatever is on the ground up next to your siding and could potentially ignite it. So, but when we're looking at the material itself of the siding, fiber cement siding, like, hardy plank or whatever, brick, stucco, things like that, masonry type materials are going to be much more fire resistant than wood or vinyl, as I just described. So this picture is basically just showing, it's a research station where they get to play with, fire and embers and build structures to see what happens, to do all this research on how things burn. And this was a house that was built half with fire resistant materials on the right side and the other half with flammable materials. And they, are blasting a bunch of embers at it to see what happens. And of course, as you can imagine, the home with the flammable siding and also a bunch of pine needles around the siding ignited. And the home with the rock right up against the siding and the fire resistant fiber cement siding, of course, did not ignite. So it's just a visual for you. And then as far as windows go, dual pane tempered glass windows will withstand a lot more heat than a single pane window, which can crack and leave the inside of your home exposed. And the thing with windows is that you want to, in a wildfire scenario, you want to keep something on the inside of your house that could ignite away from your windows, like curtains and things like that, if the heat is able to transfer through, which is not, it's not a likely scenario, but it does happen in very, very extreme conditions where you have a lot of dense fuels right up next to your house or your window. Excuse me. Actually, you know what? I'm going to add one more thing about windows that we don't always talk about. So the casing of the window is actually important as well. And a lot of windows are encased in vinyl or wood. And that is an exposure point. So if you do have a bunch of vegetation right up against your window and you have vinyl casing around your window, it's possible that vinyl can start to melt out, which would allow your window to fall out. And so there are some other things to consider when it comes to windows. Again, what's right up next to it that can carry fire to it. And then, so, you know, as far as like casing of windows, metal is the best option for that, for fire resistance. Okay, vents. As I mentioned at the beginning, vents are a very common place for embers to get blown into or sucked into and get into the inside of the house. And so the screening on the vents is really important. Gable vents like the picture shown on the left, might be on your right, I'm not sure, up at the top there. And the foundation or crawl space vents are two places that are really important to look at to make sure that you have the appropriate screening. And the recommended screening size for these vents is 1/8 of an inch metal mesh. And so really the only vent I can think of that you don't want to screen is your dryer vent, because you don't want to trap a bunch of extra lint in there and cause other issues with fire. But all of your other vents should be screened with the 1/8 inch metal mesh screening, which is available at any of the local hardware stores. And you don't have to necessarily, depending on, you know, the construction of your home, if you have a crawl space vent like this and you can't really get on the other side of it, you don't have to remove the existing screening, because typically it's about a 1/4 inch mesh size screening that's on these foundation vents. You can just add the 1/8 inch screening on top of it to make it easier. The other thing is, I've been telling people recently is that a lot of the vents on your home have a plastic cover on them. And so if you can find like and replace it with a metal cover, that even adds a little bit more protection. So especially for like your dryer vent, instead of having a plastic cover or hood, having a metal cover or hood is an improvement for fire safety as well. Okay. When it comes to decks, porches, fences, which I didn't list on here, if they are attached to the house, they're considered part of the house, which means they can carry fire to it. So the maintenance and the materials and what you have underneath these areas is really important in protecting your home. So a lot of people use their raised decks to store or the space under their decks to store, you know, firewood or lumber or whatever, all kinds of scraps, because it's, you know, it's out of the way. You don't have to look at it. It's drier. But this is not a good idea when it comes to fire resistant practices, because you're basically just creating a opportunity for, you know, a fire to build underneath your deck and ignite your deck and carry to your home. So you don't want to store anything flammable under your decks or your porches. You also want to look at the surface of your deck, because a lot of times what happens is the areas where debris tends to collect, those pine needles and leaves and things like that on your deck, typically happen in those gaps between where your siding and your deck meet. And if you don't have any metal flashing there, this is like the prime spot for embers to collect. They're going to collect in the same places that that debris collects and smolder and are easy to miss. and then start to ignite your deck and your home. So making sure that you've cleaned off your decks and your porches is really important. Getting rid of that debris on a regular basis and getting that anything flammable out from underneath your deck is really important. The decking material is really variable as far as fire resistance. I mean, we know wood will burn, but it kind of depends on how it's treated. Even the Trex decking type decks, the plastic composite decks, those are just as flammable as wood. So there are some choices out there, but they're really varied in how the deck is built and, you know, how it's treated before it is put on. So those are really important areas to consider. Some of the things you can do are, depending on how high up your deck is, you can enclose it with that same 1/8" screening. You could attach it to some lattice on the back side or the front side, depending on your aesthetics that you prefer. And sometimes just putting, you know, some gravel, like this picture, this third picture on the right shows, you know, they've put a whole bunch of gravel underneath their deck and it's kept clean because obviously they probably don't want to enclose that high of a deck, or maybe they need to get under there for a while. Land in that gravel, they're not going to ignite anything. So there's some tips on decks and porches. They are important parts of your house when it comes to fire resistance. Oh, looks like we have a extra text on this slide. I don't know what happened there. Sorry about that. Ignore that. So moving out from the house itself to that first 5 feet perimeter around your structure is really, really important as to whether your home is going to be protected or not. And honestly, that first 5 feet should be a non-flammable zone. And a lot of people like to put plants and stuff right up next to their house because it looks beautiful. But the best practice is really to keep that first 5 feet a non-flammable zone with rock or gravel or bare dirt or stepping stones or whatever it is that is not flammable, and put your landscaping and your mulch and stuff outside of that 5 feet. Because as I said, you know, depending on what type of siding you have, you know, it's possible if you have a bunch of flammable materials right up next to your house, it will be able to ignite it if fire gets in there. The other important thing is, you know, in a lot of places when we live in wooded areas, we tend to accumulate a lot of leaves and just tree debris that falls from trees and collects on our roofs, but also on the ground right up next to our house. So if you can get that stuff regularly raked out during fire season and away from the house, that's also a very good and important practice. Okay, mulch. I mentioned mulch a minute ago. We know that mulch is great for a lot of things. It helps retain soil moisture. It helps moderate the temperature of the soil. Helps discourage weeds sometimes. It can prevent erosion, and it can look really nice in your yard. So we do love mulch. However, we want to avoid, again, putting that organic mulch within 5 feet of your structure. This is just a picture from an example of when the homeowners had a bunch of mulch right up against their house and it caught on fire, and you can see that it spread to the bushes and spread to their deck. So it's just, it's flammable, and embers can get lodged in there really easy and go unnoticed and smolder for a long time before it turns into a fire and damages your structure potentially. So there are specific mulches that tend to be a little bit more flammable than others that you would want to avoid. And those are shredded rubber, which I don't usually see around here. Shredded Western, that's hard to say, shredded Western red cedar is more flammable, and then pine needles or sawdust type mulches, which are also not as common around here, I don't think. But those are the ones that you want to avoid when you're choosing your mulch. And then this is a slide that I used. I thought I'd taken it out, but I guess I didn't. But that's okay. It's got good information in it. This is actually a slide I use when I'm talking to folks who live in the Lake Whatcom watershed who have a lot of rules and important practices associated with protecting the water quality in Lake Whatcom. So I don't know if any of you live around Lake Whatcom or in the Lake Whatcom watershed, but when I'm talking to those folks and I'm talking about mulch, which is heavily, promoted as far as like, mulching over grass and putting in native land or native landscape, that's all great because it helps soak up the phosphorus that's in our water runoff. So if you are in the Lake Whatcom watershed, finding a low phosphorus mulch product is a great practice. And then, keeping your mulch watered and damp when you're watering your other plants is also a great idea to kind of help reduce the flammability of it. And then, you don't want to put it too thick, so maximum like 4 inches. And then in this picture, it's not the perfect example, but it does show how this person has, done a row of rock right up next to the house and then put their mulch outside of that. I'm going to skip that one. Okay, so I do like to have this slide about propane tanks on here because I get a lot of questions about propane tanks. And so the deal with propane tanks is that ideally they should be 30 feet from the house. I find that that's the case, and when I do risk assessments, that's the case in 1 out of like 40 homes that it's actually 30 feet away from the house. Sometimes they're buried underground, which is great, but people don't like the way their propane tanks look. So they like to hide them in the vegetation or, building a wooden fence around them or something so you don't have to look at them. But that is increasing the risk of fire spread when you do that, because the way they're designed is if there's pressure building up in them, because there's heat around it, they're built to off gas. There's a valve that opens and they off gas. And if you have vegetation that's on fire around it, you're just making a more volatile, flammable situation. So really, you should have a good 5 to 10 feet cleared around your propane tank, probably some rock under there if you can, but no tall growing grass or vegetation all around it, and preferably not like a wooden fence either. So the reason I have these pictures in here is to give people an idea of what they could do to make their propane tank more interesting. And I know some people lease their propane tanks, so don't quote me on that it's legal to do this. You should always check. But there are some options for making your propane tank more fun, like turning it into the Yellow Submarine with the Beatles on it. There you go. Okay, moving on to fire resistant landscaping. So I want to start this with, there are ideas that your landscape has to look like the surface of the moon to be fire resistant. And in our neck of the woods, it really does not. You can have a lush landscape that looks like the picture on the right, and still have a fire resistant area and property. It does not have to be concreted over. It doesn't have to be bare dirt to be a fire resistant landscaping. So I'm going to talk about the different concepts to think about when you are thinking about how to have a fire resistant landscape that is actually green and has trees and vegetation. Let's get that. Okay. So the concepts you want to think about when it comes to having a fire resistant landscape are really about incorporating breaks in the fuel on the surface of the ground. So what you're trying to avoid is having a continuous path of flammable vegetation that leads right up to your structure. So the idea is to kind of break up those planting areas, break up those fuels, so they're not so dense around your house and they don't create a path that leads right to your house. So different ways to break up your landscaping include planting in clusters with some nice, rock or landscaping border around your planting areas. Using small patches of grass is actually a fire resistant action and is incorporated into fire resistant landscapes. The important thing about lawn is you need to keep it short. It can be brown. I know we have some important water conservation practices that we like to follow in the summertime. And you don't need to be watering your lawn. It just needs to be short. So no higher than 4 inches, and having those grassy areas in between, your more natural areas of vegetation or denser planted areas can actually help slow down the fire if it's moving across the surface of the ground. And then of course, incorporating rock features or pathways or water features, things like that, that just break up the landscape a little bit so you don't have that continuous density. The other thing that's important in landscapes and in your more natural areas is not only, breaking up the space across the surface, but also creating some space vertically, because what we're trying to avoid is having a fire on the ground be able to climb up into the larger trees, up into the tree branches and ignite the trees on fire. Because once that happens, it's a totally different ballgame for firefighters to deal with. And then you're looking at potential for, embers or burning branches dropping on things. So what we call vegetation that's continuous from the ground up into larger trees is the term ladder fuel. It's basically because it's creating a ladder of fuel for fire to climb. And so within that home ignition zone, you want to reduce those the existence of those ladder fuels. So a common one that I see is tall grass up into like a patch of blackberry bushes underneath a large western red cedar tree with the branches hanging down low over the blackberries. That's basically creating like the perfect ladder for fire spread. And so whether it's pruning your large tree, your conifer tree branches up 6 to 10 to 15 feet high, depending on the size of the tree, or, removing the underbrush around it. Sometimes that's the best option if you have blackberries or other invasives that are growing under there. You want to create some of that space so that the fire isn't able to climb from the lower vegetation into the trees. And the idea isn't that we are trying to exclude fire completely from our landscape. We know it's going to happen. We know it's part of our landscape, but what we're trying to do is keep it manageable and small, because we do have some great firefighting resources that respond very quickly to small fires that are able to keep them small and put them out. So these are things to think about when you are looking at your landscaping within that home ignition zone. Okay, so another really important thing to think about is using fire-resistant plants, native fire-resistant plants in your landscape. And so most of our native plants are used to these conditions. They thrive in our conditions, even though we know some of that's changing. And because they thrive and because they're native, they tend to be less flammable. So, and of course, they are also great for wildlife. If you are trying to meet more than one goal on your property beyond just fire resistance, you're trying to, invite pollinators in or attract wildlife and things like that, you can balance some of those priorities in your landscape and still have it be fire resistant. So this is a chart that shows kind of the scale of more fire resistant plants to less fire resistant plants. And so the features of a fire resistant plant include that they tend to have higher moisture content in their leaves. They have less buildup of dense dead vegetation in the center of them. And they tend to be more resistant to drought or tolerant of drought, and they have a lower compact growth form. So it's important to note that in the right conditions, any plant can burn. No plant is going to be fireproof, but just based on certain characteristics, some plants tend to be more resistant to fire than others. And we're going to talk about more flammable plants as well. But on this chart, you can see that the succulents are at the very top as far as fire resistance goes, and then you head down to the bottom, and the grasses and the conifers are much less fire resistant than some of those other species. So what makes a plant flammable? Well, they tend to be more water stressed. They accumulate a lot of dry, dead material. There's some examples of our common common flammable plants that we have in our landscaping in this area. And they tend to have a high oil or resin content. So juniper is one that is very flammable, that is a very common landscape plant in our area. Also, the arborvitae, they make great screens between you and your neighbors, and they grow really quickly, and they just create this wall, but they're basically like Roman candles. So they're highly flammable. Scotch broom is an invasive species, as we know, and it is also highly flammable. So if you have this in your property, I suggest finding out some tips on how to get rid of it. There are some great resources available through the Whatcom County Noxious Weed webpage. They have some fact sheets on various invasive species and information on them, and then how to manage them and get rid of them. So I highly recommend checking that out if you haven't already and you have some of these species on your property. And then Himalayan blackberries are another one that are very common. Of course, they grow everywhere all the time. And the big ones, the older ones, tend to have a lot of dead canes in the center, even when they're green on the outside and they have leaves on them. So they are also very flammable. So I wanted to share some examples of fire-resistant native plants that have some habitat value, because I know I get a lot of questions from people about, which fire-resistant native plants should they put in if they also want to, meet these other goals. So I thought I'd give some examples. Nooka rose, salal, Pacific crabapple, and quaking aspen are all great options for fire-resistant plants. And of course, it depends on your site. You want to put the right plant in the right place so that they thrive. But these are good examples of plants that attract wildlife, that they can eat, that attract birds, provide cover, attracts hummingbirds and bees, which we all love. So just some crossover there in, providing habitat for wildlife and having a fire-resistant plant choice. The only thing I should mention here is that the salal is considered fire-resistant if it's kept probably 3 feet high or shorter. Once it gets really tall and bushy and dense, it tends to be less fire-resistant because it's got tends to have more density and dead stuff in the middle. So salal is kind of one of those ones that are on the fence a little bit when it comes to fire resistance. Some other examples are red osier dogwood, rhododendrons, Pacific rhododendrons, red flowering currants, and vine maple for various reasons, but mostly attracting birds and providing food and cover and things like that. So this would be a good time to mention that there is a really great fire-resistant plants for landscaping book that you can link to online. It's on our website. I'm going to share it in the chat actually when I'm done presenting so that you can access it. But if you're looking for more information on a wide range of fire-resistant plants, you can look at this booklet online, and it's got all kinds of information. It even tells you if it attracts deer, or sorry, if it's deer resistant. I think a lot of us are trying to keep the deer away. And if it attracts wildlife or pollinators and things like that. So it's a great resource, and I will share that in the chat later.
Jenny, do you know, is there off the top of your head if there is a good fire resistant alternative to the arborvitae, something that performs that hedge function
right
that people are looking for?
That's a great question. I would say, roses tend to form a nice hedge. It kind of depends on the conditions on your site, but I feel like native roses will form a nice hedge. It's not going to be the same, conical shape, obviously, and it might not be quite as tall, but it's a good start. But that's a great question. I should probably find a good alternative for that. And there might be one in that book. So it's worth checking. It's worth checking. I don't know if it would describe it that way as like a view screen between your neighbors, but that might be a good resource to look into to answer that question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So moving out beyond the sort of manicured landscaped area, if you have a more natural area or forested area on your property, some of the things to keep in mind as you are making decisions in those areas is you want to avoid having heavy accumulations of dead plant material, which we sometimes call slash or blowdown from windstorms. When you have piles like that, which can be great for wildlife, and you can have them, you just want to have them outside of your home ignition zone. You're basically creating a campfire essentially when you have the airspace and the intertwined branches and things that are very flammable, especially if there's some green on the branches still. So you want to dispose of that stuff, whether it's hauling it out and chipping it up or taking it to a disposal location. You don't want to have accumulations of that within your home ignition zone. Again, managing and reducing your invasive species like Scotch broom. And then sometimes, in certain circumstances, it does make sense to do some thinning of unhealthy trees, especially if you are dealing with drought stress trees on your property. The more trees you have on, and the more water they're going to need, right? So you want to select for the trees that are the healthiest and the biggest. And then taking out understory trees, especially if they're dead within the home ignition zone, or if they're near homes and could cause problems if they fall over or fall, if there's a recreation area nearby or a road that they could fall and, obviously do damage. Those are the ones you want to focus on taking out. And they're, as a standalone dead tree, it's not necessarily a fire hazard on its own, but it can be when you have, dense vegetation around it, because it is more flammable when it's dried out like that. And especially if there are branches still on it, because then you have that ladder fuel on that standing dead tree. The other thing that's important is if you're going to do work like pruning and thinning on your property, you should consider the timing of those activities and how they affect bird nesting season. So, which is basically March to August is kind of prime nesting time. So if you can save those activities for the fall and the winter time, you're less likely to cause issues with nesting birds. And it looks like, sorry, Cheryl, in the chat, I don't know if there are questions coming in that way.
Yeah, Brent Borden had suggested that Pacific wax myrtle could be a replacement for the arborvitae.
I'm going to have to look at the flammability of that one, because I think that might tend to be a little bit more flammable of a plant.
Oh, okay.
But sometimes you can just Google, the flammability of a plant. You'll find it on Google. But I should look into that one because I'm not 100% sure that's a fire resistant plant. But thank you for sharing that idea. Appreciate it. Okay, next slide. If we can make that happen. There we go. Okay. So some other considerations for, forest landowners. A lot of times we talk about, or you will hear the conversations about how our forests are too dense and they're overgrown and it's causing issues for wildfire, and we need to come in and thin them out. And yes, that is a strategy that is appropriate in certain situations and certain places. However, one of the things that can be important in reducing the risk of wildfire is to actually keep some canopy cover, because it does provide shade and it reduces the soil temperature. and helps retain more soil moisture, which means your vegetation is going to be less flammable. So there are different tactics and ways to look at, forest management when it comes to wildfire risk reduction. And this is an important consideration. And you can have, diversity in your forest, obviously, where you have denser areas and then you have more open areas. And having that diversity is actually great for the health of your forest. But that canopy cover does provide quite a bit of shade and help reduce, the ability for fire to spread quickly when there's more moisture retention in that soil and in that vegetation. The other thing to think about, if you have a larger property and you have some forested area to manage, is to incorporate basically trails and pathways through your forest, because it will allow a spot for firefighters to access if they need to fight a fire. It also allows them to lay hose in these areas. So it's kind of a nice access point. It creates a little bit of a break. And so those are just some other things to consider when you're looking at, managing your forested areas. So that is basically it from me. I do want to share that the Conservation District has a wildfire risk reduction program. And through that program, we offer services to landowners, including free wildfire risk assessments. And that's basically myself or another staff person who is trained on these to come out to your property. We look at your structures, we look at your landscaping. I evaluate for all the things that you saw in this presentation plus more, and provide specific recommendations for your property. At the end, you get a report that basically describes everything we talked about and shares some resources with you that you just have. Basically, it's education. It's not anything regulatory. So it's a document you can refer to when you're ready to start taking steps to reduce your risk and being able to know what those are. So we offer those. We also help neighborhoods participate in the Firewise program, which is basically a program that helps walk communities through better understanding their wildfire risk and taking action to do something about it. It's a national recognition program. I don't know how many Firewise communities there are around the country, but there's quite a few in Washington State. In fact, I think there's 7 in Whatcom County right now, and there are more coming on board. So it's a great program for communities that we help them understand and walk them through and provide them the resources they need to participate. The other thing we do is, of course, presentations and outreach events like we are doing tonight. So those are the resources we have available. If you want to sign up for any of those resources or get more information, you can go to our website and our wildfire pages, which is just whatcomcd.org/wildfire, and you should hopefully find everything you could possibly want on there and more. So I think that's it from me. There's my contact information, and I'm happy to answer any questions that have come up during the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen really quickly. Okay, Alan, it looks like you have a question.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, have you done follow-ups to see how many of your suggestions have been incorporated by the people you've dealt with?
That's a great question. And when I leave the site and I send the follow-up report, I always ask the homeowners to voluntarily share with me the things that they are doing, if they do any of them. And if they're willing to share pictures, that's even better. So I do get some folks that will follow up and say, hey, I did this, this, and that upon your recommendations, and here's some pictures. But right now, we don't have the capacity to have an organized system for following up with people. It is something that I would love to see happen, but it's not in place yet. So it's one of those things where I wish I was able to track what was going on with everyone and what they were doing. And I think we could do that. we just have to create a system that makes sense for doing that, whether it's a survey that we put out every so often to the folks that we've visited or what. But I would love to see some of that. And I have seen some really great emails and pictures and feedback. And I have a couple people that, you know, are kind of on the long-term train where they every year they send me more pictures of things they've done. And so I'd love to see that kind of stuff. But
That's
I'm
great.
just thinking in terms of having basically a rigorous estimate of the benefits from the program, because the success of a program usually generates more resources to keep it going. And
Right.
Without that, it becomes difficult.
yeah, it is challenging to track that as an accomplishment or a widget to show, hey, we've had, you know, the success of the program is shown through, you know, the fact that this many people have done, you know, these many types of activities. And it would be a good thing to be able to track and show for the success of the program. And right now, basically, the way we're tracking that is we've done this many risk assessments, you know, over this stretch of time. So
Yeah, well, it's great work, and that's thank you so much for the question, Alan. Are there any other questions?
it looks like there's a comment in the chat. Oh, okay. It's the idea.
Okay. Make some the Pacific wax myrtle makes some California lists for fire safe plants. Myrtle in the southeastern US appears to be flammable. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Plants can be tricky. You know, you might see a plant listed as a fire resistant plant in one resource and then, you know, as a flammable plant in another, or you might get some anecdotal stories from wildland firefighters who would say, no, that plant's not fire resistant. I've seen that go up like a, you know, like a bomb in fires before. So you do have to sort of take it with a grain of salt and know that it's not determining whether plants are fire resistant or not is not a hard science, I guess is what is my disclaimer I'm going to put on it.
So really making sure you're avoiding those ladder fuels, making sure you've got that defensible space around your home. That's priority number one. And then choosing plants that a lot of people say, yes, this is fire resistant.
Yeah.
That would be number two, maybe.
Yeah. And most of our native plants are, you know, with the exception of like, you know, our Western red cedars are pretty flammable, and some of our conifer species are, but.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I think that was wonderful information. I really appreciate you sharing that with us.
Thank you.